If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HasidicStory.com, HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know, you'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. I'd like to say another week, and I have some more Chassidic stories for you. But we are really living in the Chabad holiday calendar the last couple of episodes, and unintentionally the one before. And so last week was Gimmel Tammuz, the yahrzeit of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. And this week is Yud Bet and Yud Gimmel Tammuz, the festival of liberation of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. So of course I have to have stories of the Frierdiker Rebbe this week. And the truth is that I'm so busy and I have so many things going on, I did not even realize that Gimmel Tammuz was coming. And I didn't realize that Yud Bet and Yud Gimmel Tammuz were coming until, of course, Shabbos and everybody's talking about it. But Baruch Hashem, I realized it in time to record the stories for this week. And so this week I have two stories for you about and involving the Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are. Be'ezrat Hashem, may Hashem keep them all safe and healthy and successful in their missions. The returning of all the hostages, healthy and alive, and as soon as possible, if not right now. And really enough of these half deals. I never understood from the beginning of this war why we're making half deals. All of the hostages, everyone, including ones from before this war, Be'ezrat Hashem. The refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill. The comforting of those that lost loved ones, and mamash, my heart goes out to them. I feel it so deeply, personally. Hashem. And the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world. Be'ezrat Hashem. So, I start off the stories almost every week by saying how much the Jews in Europe suffered. I'm sure, by the way, the Jews in Muslim countries also suffered, just a different type of suffering. And I don't have many Chassidic stories about the Sfardim, of the Jews of the Muslim lands. But we do know that the Jews during the time of the Tsar, all of them suffered what seems like new heights of cruelty and systematic persecution. And during the reign of Tsar Nicholas II, who did not have a very long life, lived from 1894 to 1917, only 23 years old. But during those short years, he found a way to be cruel to the Jews. And there were all kinds of government decrees, expulsions, restrictions. Jews were forbidden to hold certain jobs, live in certain areas, visit certain towns, make too much money, or even practice their own religion. And the area where the Jews were allowed to live was called the Pale of Settlement. And it was easy to find the Jews, so the Goyim that hated them would come and murder Jews randomly. Those were the pogroms. And it was very difficult to make a living, not having full freedom of movement and full freedom to work in any industry or area. And it seemed that just as the Jews got over one decree, another would be added, or there'd be a pogrom. Even though the Jews really all around the world are suffering, it's much better than back then, honestly. Now, near the turn of the 19th century, meaning the late 1800s, there was a new enemy that joined the ranks of those trying to destroy Jewish life. And they came amongst the Jews themselves, and they were called the Maskilim, the so-called enlightened ones. And these were assimilated intellectual Jews who were convincing young Jews to leave a life of Torah observance and become, in quotes, free and normal people. They claimed that Judaism was backwards and that modernity demanded abandoning the old ways. And of course, this movement hasn't ended even till today. There's still the same argument and the same pushing back and forth. It was the beginning of the 1900s in Russia, and there was a large group of several hundred leading maskilim who were planning to convince the Tsar's Minister of Education to close all of the Jewish schools and to forbid the learning of Chassidus in synagogues and yeshivot. Basically, the idea was, if Jews didn't have Torah education, they would assimilate, and the Maskilim would be doing a favor for the Jews. And how amazing it is that the Jews that were in Russia and under the Soviet rule made such great efforts to fight back and hold on to their Judaism. But when they came to America or England or all kinds of other countries around the world, all of a sudden, people were just interested in making money. Now, of course, there were those that did stay connected to Judaism, but they were very small. And so you had, on the one hand, in the Soviet Union, the government oppressing the Jews. And on the other hand, you had, in America, for example, a country that more or less embraced the Jews. It's true there's a lot of anti-Semitism today, but you don't have to convince Jews to go to secular schools. On the contrary, you have to convince them to go to religious schools. And here was the opposite. Now, the Maskilim were very clever and motivated people with powerful connections and friends in the highest circles of government, and it wasn't long before the Minister of Education agreed to have a special hearing to consider their proposition. And so they prepared their case meticulously with documents and arguments designed to convince the authorities that a traditional Jewish education was a threat to the state, and to judge them in a positive way. I'll say that I really believe that their intentions were good, they were just wrong. And I'm assuming that many of the descendants of those Maskilim are no longer Jews today. And the Orthodox Jewish world in the Soviet Union was caught off guard. They didn't have any connections. They didn't have any friends in the halls of Petersburg, in the capital. And they did not know what to do. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe at the time, Rabbi Shalom Dober Schneerson, known as the Rebbe Rashab, who was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and lived from 1860 to 1920, decided to take things into his own hands and send his only son, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, to Petersburg, where all the high officials were, to see what could be done. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, by the way, lived from 1880 to 1950. So he was Rebbe for 30 years. Now, there was no plan. The Rebbe Rashab simply sent his son and said, go talk to whichever high official you can get a hold of and see what you can do. And so he got on the train and he went to Petersburg. And upon arriving there, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak realized that the situation was much worse than he could imagine, because after almost a week of trying, he had accomplished nothing. Every one of the officials that he managed to see, and even their secretaries, openly expressed their hatred for religious Jews. And they thought that this was a wonderful thing to ban religious education. He found no support in Petersburg whatsoever. And having no choice, he returned to Lubavitch to tell his father that he had failed in his mission and that all was left was to daven and they would need a miracle. But when he entered his father's room and told him the bad news, the Rebbe Rashab did not answer. He was preparing to daven in the morning, and he was checking the tzitziot, the strings on his talit, on his prayer shawl, that was over his shoulder, and he just looked up at his son without saying a word. And then Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak began relating in great detail exactly where he went, who he spoke with, how they'd rejected him, how he continued trying and met with disappointment after disappointment until he realized that there was nothing left to do and returned home. And when he finished speaking, his father told him a story. He said once the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, who was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, who lived from 1745 to 1812, sent his son, the Mittler Rebbe, Rabbi Dovber, who lived from 1773 to 1827, to the government offices in Petersburg to try to avert a certain evil decree against the Jews. And he traveled there and he did his best. But despite everything, he failed in his mission, and with no alternative, he returned to his father, the Alter Rebbe. And when he entered the house, the Alter Rebbe was standing in the middle of the room with his talit over his shoulder, checking the tzitziot before davening shachrit, the morning prayer. And he answered the Mittler Rebbe, and he said, "Do you see? This is a talis, and a talis represents the makif, and makif blinds the eyes of the chitzonim." Now, this is a very Chassidic way or Kabbalistic way of speaking, so I'll explain it to you. Of course, a talit is a shawl, prayer shawl, that we put around us. And that's makif. Makif means surrounding. It's the surrounding aspect of Hashem. And he said, the talit with the tzitziot represents the surrounding energy of Hashem. And that energy prevents any of the evil, chitzoniim, the negative energy, to succeed. So he was saying there's a power in the talis for you to succeed in your mission. And when the Mittler Rebbe heard this, he took the strings of his father's tallis, kissed them, and then returned to Petersburg and was successful. And when Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak heard the story, he immediately understood what his father was telling him. History was once again repeating itself. What had worked for his great-grandfather was apparently going to work again. And so he too grabbed the strings of his father's tallis and kissed the tzitziot with all of his heart, and then ran out the door to the train station, expecting something unexpected to happen. A few hours later, he was on the next train to Petersburg, and the next day he was once again roaming the streets of the city. But now he carried with him something more than he had the last time. Now he had the tzaddik's blessing from the tzitziot, going all the way back to the Alter Rebbe. He knew something was going to happen. And then he had a wild idea. The head of the Maskilim was a very clever and manipulative man whose name was Karps. And this Karps was so clever that he got himself appointed the rabbi of the city of Odessa. Odessa was one of the biggest Jewish communities in the Soviet Union. And even though it was a very assimilated city, and there were a lot of Maskilim there, for him to be appointed the rabbi showed the absurdity of this movement. He really represented everything that had gone wrong with the Jewish Enlightenment movement. He was one of those tragic figures who received a traditional Jewish education in his youth. Maybe he was even once a Talmid Chacham, a great Torah scholar, but he had been seduced by the false promises of assimilation in modern thinking and philosophy. And like many of the Maskilim in Odessa, he came from a religious family, but abandoned his heritage in pursuit of being accepted by the Russian cultural class. He had learned to speak and write in perfect Russian, had connections with government officials, and used his Jewish background not to help the Jews, but to betray them. In taking on the holy title of a rabbi and then using it to destroy Judaism from within, he convinced himself that he was actually liberating the Jewish people from their superstition, but really he was causing a great deal of damage. And this Karps was the one who had written all of the papers that would be used to convince the officials and ministers at the special hearing in a couple of days. And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak had the thought he should go straight to the source. He knew that Karps was staying in a hotel in Petersburg until the hearing, and with no plan, just a feeling and emunah and faith in Hashem and the Rebbe, decided to go and knock on Karps' hotel room door. Karps opens up, and immediately he recognized the son of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he graciously invited him in. He was very confident and arrogant, and he thought maybe the Lubavitcher Rebbe's son had come to be enlightened, like him. They sat down, they spoke for a few minutes, and then the conversation got around to the plans of the Maskilim, and Karps didn't deny anything. On the contrary, he was so sure of himself and what he was doing that he started bragging and boasting how he and his friends had an airtight argument. They were going to wipe out Judaism with superior logic, and they would free all the Jews from superstition, and eventually even the rabbis like him would come and thank him for the work that he had done. And then he produced a neatly bound portfolio with around 30 finely handwritten pages. This was all the paperwork that he had prepared especially for the hearing. And he held the papers in his hand and waved them. And he says, this is the beginning of the end of archaic religion. And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, he looked at Karps and he said, would you mind if I looked over your arguments? And Karps was very impressed with himself. And he knew that the Rebbe's son was a smart guy. And he thought maybe he would read it over and be convinced. So he handed him the papers. And the rabbi took the papers and walked to a corner of the room, close to a window. And Karps just figured he wanted some better light to make it easier to read. And he began flipping through the pages. And Karps says, what do you think? Pretty clever, right? And Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak says, very clever indeed. And then he opens the window and starts shredding the papers into pieces very quickly and threw them out the window like confetti flying in the wind. Karps was so shocked at what Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak had done, he slapped him in the face and he said, I should throw you out the window. It took me months to prepare that. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to have you arrested. But Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, he understood what was going on. He quickly ran out of the door, ran out of the hotel, and Karps was trying to catch up with him. He went outside trying to catch the pieces of paper, but it was hopeless. Months of work had been destroyed. The plans of the Maskilim had been destroyed. It had taken months of political maneuvering and bribery to arrange the hearing, and months more to prepare their arguments, and this was the only copy there was. Now they had no way to present their case, and the accusations were actually never made. A few months later, Karps became ill with a strange throat disease and passed away.
Bit the dust.
You know, when Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak went into Karp's room, he really didn't know what was going to happen. And when he asked to see the papers, he was actually hoping to find some argument, some weakness in their case. He was still thinking like somebody who fights with logic and political strategy. But as he held those papers in his hand, he remembered what his father had told him, that the power of Makif, the surrounding energy of Hashem, blinds the Chitzonihim, blinds the negative energy. And he felt that something was protecting him and that he could simply take the negative energy and shred it. And so instead of trying to outsmart his enemies, he acted with pure emunah, with pure faith. And you realize, my sweetest friends, this would never have happened if he hadn't returned to Petersburg the second time. After the first time, he could have just given up. He could have said, there's nothing I can do. But his father's story about the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe gave him something more precious than a strategy. It gave him absolute faith that Hashem would find a way. And that faith carried him to Karp's door, to the documents, to the right moment, and to shredding the papers. Sometimes, my sweetest friends, the greatest victories don't come from the perfect plan, but they come from the perfect faith that we have when we don't give up, so that the Ribono Shel Olam, the Master of the Universe, can show us the way. B'ezrat Hashem, we should have the same emunah when we face our own impossible situations, trusting that if we keep going, we just don't give up, the answer will appear, even if it's completely different than what we could have imagined. Hi, good Shabbos, good Shabbos, good Shabbos. I have another story for you, and this is less of a story about the Frierdiker Rebbe, but a story that the Frierdiker Rebbe himself told. He once told the story of an ordinary chassid, not a great scholar, not a great rabbi, just one of the simple chassidim of his grandfather, Reb Shmuel Lubavitch, the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who lived from 1834 to 1882. And I see that I've mentioned almost all of the Lubavitcher Rebbes except for the Tzemach Tzedek, so I'll just mention the name the Tzemach Tzedek, so we have all 7 Lubavitcher Rebbes mentioned in this episode. So this was during the time of Tsar Alexander II. Just like I had told you before, all of the suffering that the Jews had, being stuck in the Pale of Settlement, and the restrictions and the pogroms. But despite all of that, there were many Chassidim that would travel great distances in order to spend Tishrei, the high holy days, in Lubavitch with the Rebbe. And this Chassid's name was Reb Pesach, and he lived in Hummel, a town now in Belarus. And he wasn't a scholar, and he wasn't an intellectual, but he made a nice living buying all kinds of merchandise in Hummel and selling it to the shopkeepers in the hamlets around Hummel. He was a simple man with a simple trade, traveling from village to village with his wagon, honest in his dealings, and faithful in his davening. And just before Rosh Hashanah that year, in 1866, Reb Pesach joined a group of Chassidim that was being led by a Chassid whose name was Reb Mordechai Yoel. And they journeyed together from Hummel to Lubavitch to spend the days of Tishrei, the days of awe, in the court of their Rebbe, Reb Shmuel. Now, these were the days when the Chassidim would walk sometimes for weeks to reach their tzaddik. They'd leave behind their families and their livelihood, because for them, being next to the Rebbe during the high holidays was worth almost any sacrifice. And when it came time for Reb Pesach's Yechidus, his first private one-on-one with the Rebbe, he handed him a kvittel, a little note which he had written some personal details, the way that he made his living, as was the custom a simple piece of paper with one's Hebrew name, one's mother's name, and a little description of what blessing the person was looking for. And the Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, he said to Reb Pesach, you can always fulfill the words of the prophet, Se'u marom einechem, raise your eyes heavenward. And then he added something that would follow this simple merchant's heart for the rest of his life. He said, Shema is Yisrael. Right? Normally we say Shema Yisrael, but here the Rebbe said Shema is Yisrael. And that was it. His Chiddush was over. But Reb Pesach had no idea what the Rebbe meant when he said Shema is Yisrael. He knew, of course, Shema Yisrael, but he didn't know how Shema is Yisrael. So he went to Reb Mordechai Yol, who had led the group and was a renowned Torah scholar. For sure he'd be able to explain what the Rebbe meant. And Reb Mordechai Yol said in every shul there are large windows. Normally there are 12 windows for the 12 tribes. And in many shuls they'll put the names of the tribes on the windows. These windows are there not just to allow light in, but to allow people to look outside and to meditate on the greatness of Hashem. And he said that's what the Rebbe told you. Since you spend so much of your time on the road and see the sky, not only when you're sitting in shul, but a lot of the time, you're able to fulfill the instructions of the prophet Yeshayahu, Se'u merom einechem ure'eh mi shebara ele. Raise your eyes towards the heavens and see who created them. And then Reb Mordechai Yol said, the word Shema is made up of 3 letters, Shin, Mem, and Ayin. And the verse, Se'u marom einechem, also has the same 3 letters, Shin, Mem, and Ayin. So when a person says Shema with all of their heart and all of their being, they are elevated to the level of Yisrael. Now we know that the name Yaakov is a Jew who's on the level where their service of Hashem is like that of a servant. They're motivated by awe and fear. But the name Yisrael is somebody who serves Hashem like a son. For somebody who's reached the stage where their service is well beyond any fear or awe, and it comes out of love for Hashem. And he said that's what the Rebbe meant when he said Shema is Yisrael. By you always being aware of Hashem's presence, you will be worthy of being called a Yisrael, a Jew. And when this simple merchant, Reb Pesach, heard the explanation, his eyes and his heart were opened up. Years later, when Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak would tell the story about Reb Pesach, he said 25 years later, in 1891, when Reb Pesach paid a visit to Lubavitch for the Rosh Hashanah season, as he did every 2 or 3 years, he told the Frierdiker Rebbe in detail about that first Yechidus that he had in 1866. And he said, when Reb Mordechai Yol explained to me what the Rebbe, Reb Shmuel, had told me, I felt my soul lighting up, and from then on, all I wanted to do was to understand Torah. He said he had a neighbor, a Chassid, who was known as Herschel the watchmaker, and every now and then, they would sit and they would learn some Tanya, or Likutei Torah, or other Chassidic texts. And after enough years of this, he began to be able to learn these things on his own. The Frierdiker Rebbe, when he recounted speaking with Reb Pesach, he said the joy and the liveliness that Reb Pesach had was astonishing. You have to understand, he was a simple merchant. He was never a scholar. He wasn't so smart. But meeting with the Rebbe just that one time lit him on fire, and he had such a burning desire to learn and to grow and to understand the deeper meaning of Yiddishkeit. The Rebbe's words awakened something in his neshama that had been waiting all of its life to come alive. And the years went by, and Reb Pesach eventually became very wealthy and moved to Lodz, where he opened a factory. But success and wealth never dimmed that fire that had been lit at that one meeting with the Rebbe Reb Shmuel. In 1928, when Reb Pesach was around 90 years old, he again repeated to Reb Yosef Yitzchak what he had heard from the mouth of his grandfather, Reb Shmuel, with the same excitement and joy as if it had happened that day. And he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, from the time I first set out on the road after meeting the Rebbe, I always looked for a place to stay with large windows. And I would always sit next to the window so I could fulfill the words, Se'u marom einechem, raise your eyes towards the heavens. And 62 years have now passed since he was privileged to hear those words from the Rebbe, that Shema is Yisrael. And throughout all those years, whenever he would say Shema Yisrael, whenever it was during the davening, whether it was in Shachrit, or during Tachanun, or even in Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur, he always remembered that Shema is Yisrael. And he told the Frierdiker Rebbe, now I'm already an old man, and I beg Hashem that when the time comes for me to return my soul to Him, and I breathe Shema Yisrael for the last time, I pray that Hashem will give me a clear mind, so that then too I'll also be able to say the words like the Rebbe told me, Shema is Yisrael. And the Frierdiker Rebbe said, this, my friends, was just one of the ordinary, simple Chassidim of my grandfather, the Rebbe, Reb Shmuel. You see, Reb Pesach thought he was just a simple merchant, but the Rebbe saw his potential to be much more. And through those few words, Shema is Yisrael, he set him on a lifetime of spiritual seeking. For 62 years, this beautiful man carried those words in his heart. Every time he said Shema, every time he looked up at the sky, every time he saw the room with the large windows, he was reliving the Rebbe's bracha, blessing, transforming from Yaakov to Yisrael, one who serves with awe to one who serves with love. May we all merit to hear the words that will awaken our own neshamas to their deepest purpose, B'ezrat Hashem, and may we carry those words with the same joy and devotion that Reb Pesach did for all of those years. Thank you so much for listening, my sweetest friends. Thank you to all the supporters of the podcast and all of the listeners. Thank you for sharing and listening. And I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful Yud Bet and Yud Gimmel Tammuz and a good week. And until next week, my sweetest friends, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.
Bit the dust.